Hey, what's going on, everybody? Leigh Dickey here. Welcome to a brand new episode of Yo Nostalgia, the show that breathes new life into your memories. This week, I want to tell you of my memories of the American competition, sort of reality athletic type show, American Gladiators. Started in the late 80s, ran right through the mid to late 90s, I think from 89 to 1996. So if you grew up in that time period, I'm pretty sure you know what American Gladiators is. But before we get into this episode on American Gladiators, I want to tell you where you can find Yo Nostalgia. Of course, new episodes of Yo Nostalgia are released every other Tuesday on my official website, LeighTDickey.com, YouTube under Leigh Dickey TV, iTunes, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Google Play, and wherever podcasts are available. Please do comment, like, share, and subscribe. Rate us 5 stars and leave us reviews too if you would. To follow along with the show and with me, follow at YoNostalgiaShow on social media. That's Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. As well as send emails, comments, questions, topic requests, and anything else to YoNostalgiaShow at gmail.com. Alright, now that all the housekeeping is out of the way, let's get into this week's episode, and that is my memories of American Gladiators right here, right now on Yo Nostalgia. Alright, so American Gladiators. If you grew up in the 90s, you know what that is. It is this competition, reality type athletic show where you get people from all walks of life, and whether they're an athlete or not, or some sort of performer, they probably did end up on the show. I know they had teachers on the show. They had Rico Constantino, who won the whole thing, I think in about 1990 or 91. He went on to become a wrestler and had some fame in the WWE in the early to mid 2000s, I think it was. And that's actually where I discovered that he was on American Gladiators. I'm a big wrestling fan and was watching the WWE from, say, like the mid to late 90s right up until I still watch today sporadically. But, you know, I first saw him in about, I'd say, 2002, and then was flipping channels and saw his episodes of American Gladiators be rerun, and then I realized that he had a giant mullet, so that was kind of cool. I was like, really? Wow, okay. He was on American Gladiators. I had no idea, but he had a massive, like, business in the front, party in the back, super mullet. I mean, and good for him for rocking that thing back in the day. But you get people from all walks of life, and they compete in these events against these, like, humongous, like, just giants of people that they call gladiators. I mean, and they had really gimmicky names. You had Thunder, Laser, Nitro, Siren, Ice, Blaze, Gemini. If I'm missing anybody, please put them in the comments below. Or, you know, if you remember American Gladiators, tell me your memories of the show. But they'd compete in events, and it's just very athletic events, and I know that one of my first memories of American Gladiators was just flipping channels as a kid, and it was like the tail end of one episode where the competitors would run this thing called the Eliminator, which is just a series of obstacles that you would have to get over and have to complete, and, you know, get to the finish line first, obviously, in order to advance to the next stage, whether it was like a round of 16 or a round of 8, 4, and then you get to the grand final, and then, you know, standard single elimination deal kind of thing. And I thought, you know, that was cool. Like, I think the first obstacle was running up a treadmill going in reverse, and then you'd have to get across like a balance beam, and then a hand bike. And if you had like a lead, say, going into this Eliminator, say it was a 10-point lead, then that would, I think, incur a 5-second head start. Or if you fell on an obstacle, you'd get like a 5-second delay and then have to wait there. So they go across like a balance beam, and then you'd go on a hand bike to get to the next obstacle. And then it was like you'd have to get up a cargo net, and you could zip lines and what have you. And I thought the zip line was a really cool part, you know, just because you'd done all that work, you'd gotten up the reverse running treadmill, and then the balance beam, the hand bike, the cargo net, and then the zip line. You get like a 3-second reprieve, but don't ever let go, you know. And then you let go at the end, but you hit sort of like this giant sort of stuntman type airbag, and then at the end you get to jump hurdles. And then I think some of the early episodes you had to get past an actual gladiator. So like one of the, I mean, for the men, it was you had the male gladiators, and then for the women you had the females, obviously. But you'd have to get through a gladiator to actually get to the finish line. And these gladiators, you know, during the Eliminator, they would be wearing, say, like protective gear, helmet, and then they'd have like a shield that they would use to kind of like tackle you and throw you off balance or hit you, right? And I remember, you know, using shields like those and helmets like those when I took karate, martial arts, in my youth, or in my younger years anyway. I'm not that old, but you know, I guess that's what drew me to it, were the very similar types of gear and things that they would use. But I could never get over how big the actual gladiators were. But then again, like in the 80s, like big, overly muscular physiques were all the rage, whether you're powerlifting or you're like in fitness or wrestling or any sort of athletic sort of pursuit. You had to have like this big, muscular, almost like cartoonish like appearance, this cartoonish look. And whether that's steroids or not, like they were all the rage back in those days, but I don't know. You know, I'm not going to speculate. It's just what it was back in those days. And, you know, anyway, getting back to my original point, you had to get through a gladiator to get to the finish line. But I think they changed that up in the later seasons, whereas you just jump the hurdles and jump the wall, and then you just got across the finish line first. And then I think they took out that final sort of get past the gladiator obstacle in the later years. But I don't know, that was my first impression, was the Eliminator. I'd always wanted to run that, but, you know, athletic pursuits, physically, not my thing. Like, running is not my thing. I can't necessarily run. Just the way I'm physically built doesn't necessarily bode well for a guy like me. But some of the events that I remember were Atmosphere. That was one of my favorites, where you'd get the competitors in this sort of like metal chain link ball, and they'd have to, like, it's a giant ball, and they'd have to like move it around this arena floor and then hop on like pods to score a point. So every time they'd hit a pod like dead center, smoke would plume out of the sensor, I guess. You set off a sensor and then smoke would plume out of it and you score a point. Always like that, even though like I know if I were to get in there and get into like a ball of that size and try to move it around, I'm sure that they were heavy. I don't know. I've never even thought like, let's, you know, try out for the show. It was never really my thing. But I always thought that those might have been heavy, and to get enough momentum and enough pressure on a sensor to just set off this plume of smoke so you could score a point, I thought that was cool. Even though I know me, I'd probably get really dizzy and maybe even throw up, because I do get car sick. So that's just a little tidbit into me as well. But Atmosphere was one. I remember the wall where like it's rock climbing basically. You climb to the top of the wall. First person to reach the top gets 10 points. Second person, I think, you would get 5. And a gladiator would be chasing you to try and basically pull you off. They had Slingshot, which I think was you were strapped into this harness that was basically a giant elastic band, and you'd have to basically grab balls that were hanging from these multicolored balls, like a red or blue ball that was hanging from the ceiling, and then you'd have to like either take it back to your platform or just like keep a hold of it or secure it somehow. Like, I remember that, which I thought was cool, but then again, knowing me and motion sickness, probably wouldn't bode well for me. Then they had various events. Like, Assault was one of my favorites, where you're basically running a course, and a gladiator from a platform is firing on you with, like, foam weapons. Like, you have smaller weapons to try and hit a target that's above the gladiator, but they have, like, this sort of assault weapon type thing that just fires foam darts at you, while you have things like a crossbow or sort of something that looked like a super soaker that would fire darts, almost like a Nerf gun. And, you know, and so I think the last station you would just try and chuck, like, ball, like, just throw, like, little, you know, sort of sports utility balls at this target just to try and set, like, a sensor off and set the smoke plume off in order to get points and what have you. Or, like, if you couldn't incur points, there's a finish line there. You would cross it, and you'd score something if you didn't get hit, right? The whole idea of it, I think, of Assault was to just not get hit, right? And then they had Pyramid, which was another favorite of mine, where you'd have to, your competitor, Gladiator guarding said pyramid, and they have a certain task, so it's two gladiators, or two competitors at once, one gladiator per competitor, and they were basically, the goal is to get to the top of the pyramid, and the gladiator's goal is to make sure that you don't get there, whether it's like by tackling you to get you down to the bottom so you have to start again, or basically by any means necessary. I always thought that that was cool. And of course they had hosts like Mike Adamle was the host for the show's entire run. I'm talking the original show. Like, I'm not necessarily going to get into the reboot that had Hulk Hogan and Layla Ali from the late 2000s, but the original show, you had Mike Adamle, Joe Theismann was there for a year, and then you had Larry Zonka, the former Miami Dolphin football great. I think even one of the former Gladiators came in the final season. You had Dan Clark, who was Nitro, the Gladiator in the show's early run. I think he was there as a Gladiator from like 89 to 93 or 94. And here's the thing, they had, I think, someone named Lisa, I think Molesky was her last name. I don't think I've ever seen any of her episodes. Not that she escaped me. I don't know whether or not, like, the Canadian syndicator, because I'm in Canada, I grew up here, and, like, we have access to all the American programming and what have you. Obviously, that's how I saw American Gladiators for the first time, because it's syndicated up here. It's syndicated in the States, too, but, I mean, like, we have syndication rights up here for the show, or at least we did, and I don't think her episodes were syndicated up here, ever. You know, I remember seeing reruns of the show on what is now the Paramount Network, but back back when I saw the reruns when I was in about, I think, grade 9 or grade 10, so I was a freshman or sophomore in high school, they were on TNN, which is now obviously the Paramount Network, and was Spike TV, but I remember seeing those as soon as I would come home from school. It was like 3:30, 4 o'clock in the afternoon when I was in, like, high school. I would just tune in and watch that stuff. Because there wasn't much on, you know, in those days when it came to, like, afternoon TV. And, like, you know, I wasn't really watching cartoons in those days. So, like, American Gladiators was cool. I did see some of Joe Theismann's run. I saw a lot of Larry Zonka's run. Saw a bit of Dan Clark, a.k.a. Nitro, as co-host. But I don't think I ever saw Lisa Molesky's episodes at all. Like, I know Mike Adamle hosted the show for its entirety. And, you know, some people that, if you're a wrestling fan, he was the general manager of Monday Night Raw for a spell. And I think he was a commentator, too, for the WWE ECW brand. But, like, you know, that's American Gladiators for you. Like, one of my other favorite events is Powerball, which is basically, like, it's sort of like tackle football, where you take balls and you're running to either side of the arena, and you've got to put ball into sort of like a bucket. But you also have various pods or scoring pods, I guess, that you can dunk the balls through. Certain pods are 1 point, other pods are 2 points, and you just have to get as many points as possible. I mean, I always thought that was a cool event. Joust was one of those where I know if that were me, I would take a beating in Joust. If I were a gladiator, or if I were a competitor on American Gladiators, I would take an absolute beating. Okay? Just because my balance isn't that great, it never has been. I mean, I can thank, I guess, cerebral palsy for that. Thank you, by the way. Not complaining, just saying. And, like, I know that, like, get me on a platform, my balance isn't great, I'm probably going to fall off anyway and just give the gladiator the win by default, because a strong gust of wind, if I'm not paying attention, will probably blow me over. I know for me, Joust, I would take a beating, and that's just how the story goes sometimes. But I loved American Gladiators, right? Seeing what those people, what those, like, everyday people could get up to. Like, they had I think a Power Ranger stunt double on the show once, and like I said, Rico Costantino, who was a WWE superstar and a wrestler for a little while in the mid-2000s, like late 90s, mid-2000s, up to the mid-2000s, I should say. But, you know, anybody from any sort of background could be on the show. They had teachers, professors, mechanics, anybody, firemen. You know, I always thought it was cool. I always thought it was something different, and I guess maybe that's why I gravitated towards it. But there are my memories of American Gladiators. What do you guys think of the show? Of course, like, they had the reboot with Hulk Hogan and Layla Ali. I didn't mind it. Didn't like it as much as the original show, because it was just, like, I understand that shows like American Gladiators are gimmicky and over the top. But when it came to the reboot, I just, you know, I had moved on to other things, and it wasn't within my viewing habits. I tried to like it. I just couldn't. It's just not my thing. And they had, you know, several, like, former wrestlers that were on the reboot. Like, they had Matt Morgan, who was known as The Beast, I think in season 2 of the reboot. And then you had Justice Smith, who had auditioned for WWE Tough Enough, I think sometime in the early to mid-2000s. Somewhere in there, and, you know, good for them. But the reboot, not something I was a fan of, just because it had American Gladiators on it. Yeah, it wasn't really my thing. I love the original show, though, because it just had a charm, and it was something different. It was something else that you could see on TV, and the fact that it's still rerun to this day is legitimately really, really cool. And I know that you can find the older episodes anywhere you look these days with the advent of technology. But there you go. Those are my memories of American Gladiators, the original run from 89 to 96. Let me know what your memories of the show are. Leave them in the comments. Follow along on social media at YoNostalgiaShow, Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. Send your emails, comments, questions, and everything else to YoNostalgiaShow@gmail.com. Subscribe to Leigh Dickey TV on YouTube for episodes every other Tuesday. And of course, we're on your favorite podcast apps and players of choice: iTunes, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Google Play, and my official website, LeighTDickey.com. All the information is in the show notes and descriptions down below. All right, I've been Leigh Dickey. This has been another episode of Yo Nostalgia. We will see you guys in 2 weeks. Thanks again for watching. Take care. We'll talk to you soon. Peace.